So, like a lot of you, I've been playing some Final Fantasy XVI the past few days, and it is great. The combat is a ton of fun, especially once you start unlocking more icons and abilities and start utilizing positioning well. The story is excellent, both from writing, acting, and direction, something that shouldn't be surprising since this is mostly the same team that worked on Heavensward. And it goes without saying how good the music and visuals are, even the worst Final Fantasy games get that right. Naturally, the game has been garnering a lot of praise as well as criticism. I mean, that's pretty par for the course for any popular release now. It'll always get plenty of both massive haters and massive fanboys and every shade in between. Aside from the alleged streamlining of RPG elements, one of the most contentious points of debate in this game is whether or not it's really a Final Fantasy game. Of course, the cheeky fellow is like, well look, it says Final Fantasy on the box, of course it's Final Fantasy, but I don't think anyone actually takes this argument seriously. I mean, if you made a GTA-style crime simulator with no magic, no fantasy elements, and just slapped the Final Fantasy title on it, nobody would be using this argument as a defense. We all understand that this question is meant to be, is this in the spirit of Final Fantasy? And that answer is a bit trickier. I mean, to some extent, the answer is obviously, no, obviously not. This is clearly not in the spirit of Final Fantasy in a number of ways. I really don't see how that can even be a point of debate. It's a massive departure in many significant ways. There's no turn-based or command-based combat, it's a full-on action game, no party control or customization, a pretty key element to every other mainline game, and the tone is significantly darker with much more violence, gore, and sex. While all tastefully handled, I think, it's still pretty out of line with everything else. That and all the elements of camp and silliness that you'd see in every other game in the series have been completely removed, more or less. And those aren't minor elements, they're pretty significant to the experience of the majority of the past games. I think where the tricky part comes in is that Final Fantasy has kind of been going through an identity crisis for about 20 years now, a point where it would be a lot more accurate to call Final Fantasy a brand and not really a series. You could certainly call 1 through 9 a series, there's a very consistent style to its story, tone, and gameplay structure. It is debatable, but definitely starting with 11, the series began making massive changes to each game, more or less moving further and further away from the style with each new entry, to the point where FF15 became an open-world, largely action-focused, with a much more modern-day setting. Each game is so radically different that if someone were to call themselves a Final Fantasy fan at this point, it would be pretty hard to know what that even meant. Which is why my position is that not only is it obviously okay to not like FF16, it's completely reasonable to. Changes made here aren't insignificant. Action and turn-based games are radically different, both in their design and in how the player engages with them. They require a very different set of skills that a player who's a fan of the opposite style may just not have. Someone who's into turn-based or ATB-based games just may not have the skill to handle an action-based, combo-based, and reaction-based game that well. And if someone were to say, well, just play on story mode, well, that's kind of the problem though. You're essentially having to throw out half the game in order to enjoy the half that you might like. Because, at least when it comes to games, most gamers don't like a series because of the brand or the title. They like it for the content, for the tropes and elements that are common throughout the series. And if someone were to say, well, I don't really like turn-based games, I like action games much better, well then you don't really like Final Fantasy. And I don't mean that in any way to be disrespectful, but that is what classic Final Fantasy is, the turn-based ATB style. And if that's not for you, I mean, at that point, is it really fair that the game be designed for someone like you and not someone who is a fan of what the series has been previously? Because regardless of what your opinion on FF16 or any game is, you have to understand, without those classic fans, there would be no Final Fantasy 16. There would be no Final Fantasy, period. I take big issue whenever I see an attitude of dismissal or condescension towards classic fans of any property. And I think you all know plenty of examples of what I'm talking about. Because the only reason any of these properties exist is because of those fans. They're the ones who bought it. They're the ones who played it. They're the ones who spread the word about it, who told other people about it. They are the reason this series got to where it is. By no means does this mean classic fans are always right. I mean, obviously, they're not a monolith, they don't always agree with each other. But as a creator or a fellow fan, I think they are completely deserving of your respect at the very least. Especially from people who are new fans of a series who have not been there to help contribute to its growth all these years. And to be crystal clear, this is also not me saying that all opinions on the matter are equally valid. Some people are just wrong, objectively. And some people may just have personal reasons for not liking something that are irrelevant to its actual quality. Speaking personally, while I understand much of the criticism of this game, I think a lot of it is overblown. I think this game more than deserves the moniker of Final Fantasy, and were I to build a full argument, one of my starting points would be Lost Odyssey. Those unaware, Lost Odyssey is a turn-based RPG made for the Xbox 360 that was developed by Final Fantasy's original creator, Hironobu Sakaguchi. And despite being turn-based and not rated M, that game actually has many similarities to Final Fantasy XVI in both its style and tone, including the darker, more tragic tone in a world with lots of political intrigue. And even if we were going to dismiss that argument altogether, I would still make a strong case that the game is exceptionally well made on its own right. I have a couple small issues, like why on earth am I not able to sprint at will? And enemies can be pretty spongy at the start when you have a limited set of abilities. If this was the direction mainline Final Fantasy were to take from here on out, I personally wouldn't have much of an issue with that, provided I would like to see some more classic elements return, such as more customization and control over your party, as well as things like status ailments and elemental damage. My personal take on the game aside, it has clearly been receiving massive amounts of praise from all over the place. And as such, even though I don't agree, I wanted to make sure that people who had more criticisms with the game or didn't necessarily like the direction felt at least like they were being heard and understood. There's way too much unironic animosity between different people in our industry, and I'd like to do as much as I can in both these videos and my own work in alleviating that as much as possible. Anyway, I hope you got something useful out of this. That's all.